Paramedics, a former police supervisor, and George Floyd's girlfriend all took the stand on Thursday, delivering more powerful testimony in day 4 of Derek Chauvin's murder trial. Retired shift supervisor Dave Pluger was on duty the day Floyd died. He told the court about his initial interaction with Chauvin and how the former officer explained his side of the encounter. Pluger also told the court he believed the officers should have stopped restraining the 46-year-old sooner. We also heard from Floyd's girlfriend. She spoke about the man that she loved and their shared struggles with drug addiction. CBS News correspondent Jamie Yuccas is in Minneapolis with the latest.
Dramatic, never-before-seen video of the ambulance team arriving to save George Floyd's life. Paramedic Seth Bravender says the first thing he saw was multiple officers still on top of Floyd.
From what I could see where I was at, I didn't see any breathing or movement or anything like that.
Bravender makes a hand gesture at Officer Derek Chauvin, telling him to move, as his partner, paramedic Derek Smith, checked Floyd's pulse.
What did his condition appear to be to you overall?
In lay terms, I thought he was dead.
Smith says he wanted to move Floyd to a different location to get away from the crowd.
There was multiple cell phones out. There was elevated tones used.
The prosecution showed these disturbing images inside the ambulance as emergency responders worked frantically to resuscitate Floyd. They say the cardiac monitor showed Floyd had flatlined.
At any point, did he regenerate a pulse or come to? Was he revived?
No.
And today, jurors learned about George Floyd, the man, from the woman who loved him. Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, says they first met at a shelter where he had worked. She was there to talk to her son's father and was visibly distressed when Floyd approached her.
Sorry. He said, well, can I pray with you? It was so sweet.
She says Floyd worked out every day and loved food. But she says he was devastated after his mother's death in 2018. He also struggled with drugs.
Floyd and I both suffered with an opioid addiction. It's a classic story of how many people get addicted to opioids. We both suffered from chronic pain. Mine was in my neck and his was in his back.
Ross testified that Floyd had bought drugs from Maurice Hall, the person sitting in the passenger seat of Floyd's SUV on the day of the police encounter. He's refused to testify, citing his Fifth Amendment right.
On Friday, prosecutors are expected to use the Minneapolis police chief to make their case against his own former officer. He fired Derek Chauvin days after George Floyd died, and all eyes will be on the answer to one question. In his opinion, did Chauvin use excessive force when his knee was on Floyd's neck? Lana?
Really emotional stuff today. Jamie, thank you. For more now, let's bring in Kim Wehle. Kim is a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law and author of the book, How to Read the Constitution and Why. Kim, we heard Derek Chauvin's former shift supervisor say officers should have stopped restraining George Floyd sooner when he was no longer resisting. How important is his assessment to the prosecution's case?
Well, it's important because it gets to the critical question of causation of the death. So as we've seen, police officers often have to use force in order to manage difficult suspects or to manage the crowd. That's not illegal. That's not a crime. So the question in this moment comes down to whether Chauvin crossed a line. At some point, did he move from the need to use force to something that is criminal, either manslaughter, murder 2, or murder 3. And this testimony suggests that at least from this former supervisor, shift supervisor in that moment, that he did, from a professional standpoint, from this witness's point of view, cross the line, that he should have taken his knee off the neck earlier than he did, which was not until the first responders came on the scene and took some steps to take over the scene.
Kim, let's talk about the testimony that we heard from George Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross. She admitted that the two of them used opioids. The defense's central argument is that Floyd died because of drug use and a heart condition. So how might her testimony impact this case?
Same issue here, Lana, which is the question of causation. Was it the knee on the neck that actually ultimately caused his death? It might be upsetting. It might be maybe crossing even a line in terms of police force. But the question is it a substantial contributing factor to the death? The law in Minnesota does not require a proof beyond a reasonable doubt that it's the only cause. But I think the defense argument is going to be, based on the testimony we heard from his girlfriend and presumably some experts in forensics and pathology, the testimony or the argument will probably be something along the lines from the defense that he had some pre-existing condition, he had drugs in his system, that it was his condition that actually ultimately led to the death, that the force placed on his neck wasn't enough to actually kill him.
Kim, I want to ask you about something that we heard from Jamie's reporting, that Maurice Hall is refusing to testify, citing his Fifth Amendment right. Remember, Floyd's girlfriend says that Hall supplied the drugs. He was in the car with Floyd. Why would someone plead the Fifth in this sort of situation? And how might Hall's refusal to testify impact either the defense or the prosecution's case?
Well, I mean, the Fifth Amendment is the right that every American has, or everyone in America has in a criminal context, to not incriminate themselves, that the government can't force you to testify in a way that could ultimately put you in jail. So based on what we know, we haven't heard the testimony relating to what was happening in the car prior to the incident. It's possible, conceivable, that there was something illegal relating to drugs, and this witness doesn't want to be forced to say something that could ultimately be turned against him individually in some kind of later criminal process. Now, how does this affect the defendant's case? You know, we've seen all along these multiple narratives. One of the narrative being that, you know, George Floyd had a history of drug use. I think his girlfriend here painted it in a pretty compassionate light. I mean, there are millions of Americans that are struggling with opioid addiction. This is a huge public health problem. It's something that legislators need to step up and deal with. But to the extent to which Floyd can be, quote, put on trial in this to divert the jury from Mr. Chauvin, I think that's a tactic that is squarely within a legitimate kind of defense. This defense team doesn't have a lot to work with, you know, given what we've seen so far, given the multiple videos, given the very, very compelling testimony, not just around the 9+ minutes that this force seemed excessive, but also the witnesses who watched this and were traumatized. We've heard witnesses say this was hard to even to watch from the sidelines. I tried to help and stop this and was treated in a hostile manner, not in an open-minded manner. So the defense has a very, very uphill battle. The thing to keep in mind, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's up to the government to prove this case, not up to Mr. Chauvin to disprove this case. And the government has to convince all of the jurors here. But Mr. Floyd is not on trial. And I think that's where this narrative around his drug use could get a little tricky in theory for the prosecution.
Yeah, a very important point there, Kim. You were bringing up the witnesses, people who were in the crowd gathered around George Floyd in those final moments. I want to ask you about the defense's strategy, because they've asked several witnesses about the demeanor of the crowd there. What are former Officer Chauvin's attorneys trying to argue?
Again, I think it's a distraction. It's a deflection on one hand to maybe discredit some of these witnesses. I'm not so sure that's been particularly successful, to suggest that, you know, they can be impeached or discredited because they were, you know, had some elevated excitement in that moment, had some emotional reaction. But I think the other possible defense is to suggest that the officers, the three officers that were on Mr. Floyd, including Mr. Chauvin, whose knee was on Mr. Floyd's neck, that they were distracted by the ruckus, that the crowd made the situation unnecessarily elevated, and that should come into play given the totality of the circumstances, that what was on the plate of these officers wasn't just managing the situation with Mr. Floyd, but managing the broader crowd. That's a really difficult, I think, narrative to win, given, again, what we've all seen, the witnesses standing on the sidewalk, getting increasingly agitated after pleading for the officers to take pulses to his pulse, pleading for the officers to give Mr. Floyd medical care, particularly after he went limp. Again, tough defense position to be in. They're doing what they can with not very good facts, given all of the evidence we've seen thus far.
Kim Wehle, thank you.
Thanks for having me.